Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's an honor for me to join you, and thank you for those of you who are joining us in person. So we stand at an important and difficult juncture in history. The present direction of our civilization is clearly untenable, and the solutions that are being promised by our political classes appear to be inadequate to the crisis that we face. But we're at an impasse, uncertain about what needs to be done and how to do it. The old world is dying, and the new world is struggling to be born. Let us begin by facing the problem. We know that the global economy is driving dangerous ecological breakdown. We're presently at 1.2 degrees of global warming, and already the effects are clearly disastrous. It's critically important that we make every effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, in line with the Paris Agreement, because we know that warming toward 2 degrees is highly likely to trigger several tipping points in the Earth system, including the collapse of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, coral reef die-off, and mountain glacier loss. And yet, according to the IPCC, existing government policies have us on track for 3.2 degrees of global warming this century, in the lifetime of present generations. Humans have never lived on such a planet. Scientists warn of crop yield decline, widespread species extinction, human displacement, and political upheaval. And climate is not the only crisis we face. We're also overshooting 5 other planetary boundaries, including ecosystem degradation and a staggering collapse of biodiversity. Now, this is not because of ignorance, or individual behavior, or lack of concern. People care. People want to change course. But we are trapped by certain structural features of the capitalist system. And by capitalism here, let me be clear, I do not mean simply markets and trade and businesses. These things existed for thousands of years before capitalism, and they're innocent enough on their own. The key problem we face is that capitalism is organized around and dependent on perpetual growth, ever-increasing levels of industrial production. If it does not grow, it collapses into crisis, causing unemployment and misery with devastating consequences for working-class communities. This system is extremely unstable. It's also profoundly undemocratic. Under capitalism, decisions about what to produce and how to use our collective labor and resources are determined by those who own and control capital. And for capital, the purpose of increasing production is not primarily to improve people's lives or to achieve specific social and ecological goals. Rather, it is to extract and accumulate an ever-increasing quantity of profit. That is the overriding objective. And this arrangement overwhelmingly benefits the rich, of course, and also ropes us into perverse forms of production. SUVs instead of public transit, advertising instead of affordable housing, fast fashion instead of nutritious food, and consumer electronics and white goods that are designed to break down in order to increase product turnover. This is what is driving ecological breakdown. We have an economy that massively overuses resources and energy, and yet remarkably nonetheless still fails to meet many basic human needs. It is irrational and inefficient. Now, scientists are clear that it is the rich economies of the global north that are overwhelmingly responsible for the ecological crisis. Their use of energy and resources is extremely high, several times over the sustainable boundaries, and vastly in excess of what would be required to ensure decent lives for all. What is more, the constant hunt for more growth in the global north relies on a constant net appropriation of materials, energy, land, and labor from the territories of the global south. This drains poorer countries of resources that are necessary for developments. It colonizes their lands. It produces global inequality. And it means that the social and ecological costs of growth are offshored or externalized onto vulnerable communities. And yet, note this. Despite all of this immense production and appropriation, social problems remain entrenched. In the US, one of the richest countries in the world, 1/4 of all people live in substandard housing, and nearly half cannot afford healthcare. In the UK, 4.3 million children live in poverty. In the Netherlands, 1 million people do not have secure access to food. Why? Because the enormous productive capacity of these countries is mobilized to serve the interests of capital rather than to secure the well-being of people. Our economic system fails in both ecological and social terms. So what do? What does the new world look like? For 50 years, our ruling classes have promised that green growth will save us. They say that efficiency improvements will allow capital to continue increasing production and profits, while at the same time reducing ecological impacts back to sustainable levels. It sounds nice, but of course it hasn't happened. And today, scientists challenge this narrative on empirical grounds. Let's talk first about emissions. Yes, several high-income countries have been increasing their GDP, while at the same time reducing emissions, even in consumption-based terms. The Netherlands is one of them. Politicians and media have hailed this as evidence of green growth, but this narrative is scientifically incorrect. Yes, of course it is possible to absolutely decouple GDP from emissions, simply by shifting to lower carbon sources of energy. This has been happening in some countries since the 1990s. It's not news, it is fully expected. The problem is, when it comes to climate mitigation, what matters is speed. To meet the Paris Agreement goals, nations need to cut their emissions fast enough to stay within their fair shares of the global carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. For high-income nations, this is extremely challenging precisely because they have such high levels of energy use. None of them are on track to meet the Paris goals, not even close. At existing rates of emissions reductions, the Netherlands will take 200 years to reach net zero and will burn its fair share of the carbon budget 7 times over. If all nations were to overshoot their carbon budgets like the Netherlands is on track to do, we would be headed for around 4 degrees of global warming. There's nothing green about this. It's a recipe for disaster. We need much faster rates of mitigation. And the plain truth is that growth makes this task extremely difficult to achieve. And the reason for this is simple. It's because more production means more energy demands than would otherwise be the case. And more energy demands makes rapid decarbonization harder. It's like trying to run down an escalator that is accelerating upwards against you. So, green growth proponents know this is a problem, and they deal with it in several ways. First, they assume that efficiency improvements can be ramped up to historically unprecedented levels, and this will be enough to do the job. But this claim is not supported by empirical literature. Studies have repeatedly shown that in a growth-oriented economy, savings from efficiency are leveraged or reinvested to expand the process of production and accumulation, which wipes out much of the gains and makes progress very difficult to achieve. Second, green growth scenarios assume a mass deployment of speculative negative emissions technologies, mostly bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But scientists warned this approach comes with several major problems. It would require biofuel plantations up to 3 times the size of India, okay? Dramatically exacerbating deforestation, biodiversity loss, and constraints on human food systems. Moreover, if negative emissions schemes fail, then we're stuck in a hothouse trajectory from which it would be impossible to escape. It's an extremely dangerous gamble with the future of human civilization. Third, green growth scenarios maintain unnecessarily high levels of energy use in rich countries and among the rich by suppressing energy use in the global south and by appropriating southern lands for biofuel plantations. This approach perpetuates colonial inequalities. It is immoral, unjust, and unacceptable. Finally, even if we imagine all of these problems away, we have to deal with another issue. Regardless of the type of energy we use to power our economy, more growth means more material extraction, which is the single biggest driver of biodiversity loss and ecosystem damage. Several major scientific reports have found that sufficient reductions in material use are unlikely to be achieved if rich nations continue to pursue increased aggregate production. So this is not good enough. We can and we must do better. We cannot just ignore science. We cannot just ignore injustice. We need solutions that deal with the ecological crisis and the social crisis together. In its latest report, the IPCC points to scholarship on degrowth as an alternative path. Degrowth research, let me specify, embraces efficiency improvements. It embraces technological innovation, but it recognizes that this alone will not be enough, and therefore also calls for rich nations to abandon GDP growth as an objective and scale down destructive and less necessary forms of production to reduce energy and material use directly. Now remember, GDP is an aggregate metric. It does not distinguish between $1,000 worth of bombs and $1,000 worth of healthcare. Even the man who invented GDP himself warned that this metric should never be used to measure social progress, because in reality, it's not aggregate production that matters, but rather what we are producing, whether people have access to the essential goods they need, and how income is distributed. So instead of blindly chasing GDP growth and hoping this will magically solve our social and ecological problems, let us be clear about what we actually want to achieve and target those things directly. This focuses the minds on what is important. For degrowth transition, the goal is to organize the economy around human well-being and ecology with 3 core values: equality, sufficiency, and economic democracy. Okay? So the first step is we need to decommodify and expand and improve essential public services: healthcare, education, housing, public transit, clean energy, water, internet, nutritious food. Mobilize the productive forces to ensure that everyone has access to these things they need to live a good, dignified life, regardless of fluctuations in aggregate output. This stabilizes the economy. It directly cuts the cost of living and improves the welfare purchasing power of income. Second, introduce a climate job guarantee with workplace democracy and living wages. The goal here is to empower people to train and participate in the most important collective projects of our generation: building renewable energy capacity, insulating homes, restoring ecosystems. This is urgent, socially meaningful, socially necessary forms of production. This approach abolishes unemployment. It abolishes economic insecurity. It improves the bargaining power of labor. It delivers high well-being for all and enables us to pursue radical climate policy without anyone getting hurt. This is the bread and butter of a just transition. In other words, we need to improve socially necessary sectors, and with this foundation in place, we can then scale down socially less necessary sectors, right? Private jets, SUVs, airlines, mansions, beef, fast fashion, advertising, arms, single-use packaging, the practice of planned obsolescence. In other words, forms of production that are organized mostly around capital accumulation and elite consumption, and which are largely irrelevant to human well-being. As part of this, we can also introduce policy to extend product lifespans and guarantee rights to repair. If our products last twice as long, then we need half as many, with no loss to our access to important things. Next, we need to curtail the purchasing power of the rich.
Mr. Hickel?
Yes.
You said you would need around 10 minutes. We're going
I was
a bit
told,
over the...
I was told 15, I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, continue
I'm
then.
concluding
Yeah,
now.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
We need to curtail the purchasing power of the rich using policy tools such as wealth taxes and maximum income ratios. Now, this may sound radical, but think about this. Right now, millionaires alone are projected to devour 72% of the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. This is an egregious assault on humanity and the living world. We need to realize that it is irrational and unjust to continue to devote energy and resources to supporting an over-consuming class in the middle of an ecological emergency. So policies like these would dramatically reduce energy use. They would allow us to achieve a much faster transition to renewables. And as our society requires less aggregate production, we can shorten the working week, give people more free time, and share necessary labor more evenly. This approach has been shown to have strong positive effects on mental health, physical health, and gender equality. Finally, the central pillar of degrowth scholarship is economic democracy. Democratize workplaces, democratize finance, democratize public services, democratize the media. We know empirically that when people have democratic control over production, they choose to use resources more wisely. They focus on what is required for human welfare, and they sustain ecosystems into the future. Radical democracy is the antidote to a socially and ecologically destructive economy. Now, this may sound utopian, but know this. The policies I've listed here happen to be extremely popular. Universal services, a green job guarantee, working time reduction, living wages, an economy focused on well-being and ecology rather than growth. Polls and surveys show strong majority support for these ideas. And official citizens' assemblies in Spain and France have called for precisely the kinds of transition that I've suggested. With this path, we can build a more efficient, more rational, more just economy that ensures good lives for all within planetary boundaries. People often say that 1.5 degrees is dead, that there's no feasible path to sufficiently rapid decarbonization. But this is only true if we continue to assume growth in rich countries. If we liberate ourselves from this assumption, then 1.5 degrees is back on the table. Models show that with post-growth, post-capitalist transition, we can achieve our ecological goals and improve social outcomes at the same time. It is technologically feasible. It is ecologically coherent. It is socially just, and it is decolonial. This is a future worth fighting for. But none of this will happen on its own. It will require a political movement that unites environmentalists with labor unions and working class formations. It will require a struggle against those who benefit so prodigiously from the status quo. It will require organizing, and it will require courage. But so has every movement for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now